One of my most popular beginners After Effects Skillshare courses just turned 10 years old with over 26,000 students and more than 600 project submissions. And to celebrate today, I've updated, re-recorded, and expanded the course for 2025, and I'm giving it away for free right here on YouTube. This course is designed to be your very first motion graphics project in After Effects. There are no prerequisites. You don't need any prior experience with the software, and together we'll animate and export this motion design project. I've also expanded the course to include 2 more sets of artwork that can be animated using the exact same techniques as the first so that you have some options. And if you're feeling really ambitious, you can even design and animate your own artwork. If at any point you need to take a break and come back to the lessons, I've split the course up into organized video chapters so you can easily find your place. And once you've completed this first step into motion design and you're ready to jump in, check out my other course, Launch into After Effects, the most comprehensive intro to After Effects ever. Through more than 20 hours of structured, focused video lessons, you'll make 10 exciting motion design projects, each teaching you a different aspect of the software. And just for watching this course on YouTube, there's a special discount down in the description, so don't forget to take advantage of that. Now, if you're ready to get started, give this video a like, hit that subscribe button, and let's get started on our first After Effects project. First of all, there's a link in the description to download the artwork for this class, as well as my completed project files in case you want to take a look at them. And like I said, all 3 projects use the exact same animation techniques, so you can really choose whichever one you'd like to use. But if this is your first time using After Effects, it might be best if you follow along with the airplane project and then go back to one of the other projects once you're a little more comfortable. So download and extract that zip file and we can get started. Go ahead and open up After Effects. I've gone ahead and reset my preferences here, so my After Effects should look just like yours if this is the first time you're opening it up. We don't actually need this little Welcome to After Effects window, so I'm gonna go ahead and close that. And I will point out that at the time of this recording, I'm using After Effects 2025. So if you're in a future version, it might look slightly different, but the basics should be pretty similar to what I have right here. So if your After Effects layout doesn't look like this one, then come up to the Window menu and go to the Workspace menu and set it to default. And if you've done that and it still doesn't look like this, then come up to this menu right here or back to the same Window Workspace menu and say Reset Default to save the layout. And that should get you to what you see here. Now there's a lot to After Effects, don't be overwhelmed. We're not gonna cover each and every single one of the things that you see on screen here. We're just gonna take a look at what we actually need. So over here on the left side is the project panel, and this is where all of the assets that we get into After Effects are going to live, as well as anything that we create inside of After Effects. It'll show up here kind of like a directory. And all we need to do to get that artwork into After Effects is double click in the project panel and navigate to where those files are on your computer. So I'm gonna just grab the airplane and click on Import. Now it's going to ask me how I want to import this, and it's important that we do this in a specific way. So on the import kind, I don't want to use footage, I want to switch this to composition. So that's the first important thing. And then we're going to have this other option down at the bottom, footage dimensions. We want to make sure this is set to layer size, not document size. So composition is your import kind, layer size is your footage dimensions, click OK, and that's gonna bring it into After Effects. Now a few different things happened, let's take a look. First of all, we have this first item called airplane, and under the type column here, you can see that it is a composition. So a composition is kind of like a document, that's what we'll be animating in, and then underneath that is a folder. It says airplane layers. Inside that folder, we have Illustrator files for each and every one of the layers within that document, and you can see they all came from the same Illustrator file, airplane.ai. So these are the source assets for the artwork, and inside this composition, we can see a thumbnail preview up here contains the actual assembled artwork. So I'm gonna double click on that composition, and that will open it up in a larger view, and this is where we're gonna be doing our work. Now I want to point out something right away. Over here in the project panel again, up at the top, it's telling us a little bit of information about that composition. First of all, its name, but also how big it is in terms of its resolution. So this is 1080 by 1080. That's the size that I designed it in Illustrator. So the composition matches that. And then underneath this, we have a whole bunch of numbers and some letters. So what is that talking about? Well, this first group of numbers is the duration of the composition measured in timecode, which starts with the smallest increment being frames, then seconds, minutes, and hours, and that's something I want to change right away. So let's come over to our composition menu and down to composition settings. This will affect whichever composition you have open, and we can change things about the composition like the resolution as well as the frame rate and the duration. So frame rate is how many frames are played back in a video or an animation in a single second, and it's defaulted to 29.97 frames per second. This is an old broadcast standard. It actually is still in use today, but for the internet, this is not something we need to be fractions of a frame per second. So we're gonna change this to a different preset, which is just 30 frames per second. We're gonna round it up to 30, and that'll work just fine. And then down here at the duration, this is saying that it's 29 seconds and 29 frames long. I don't need it to be that long. I'm going to shorten this to, let's just say 10 seconds even. So I'm just gonna type in 10 seconds right there and click OK. And my composition has been updated to match those settings. We didn't really see any visual difference, but if we take a look at this panel down here, this is our timeline. This is a representation of all of the layers in our composition over time. So if we take a look at these numbers up here, you can see that they're marked in seconds, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 10, and that's the end of my timeline. That's how long we just set our composition to be. Everything that we create is gonna exist within these 10 seconds of time. That's probably more time than we need, but I like to give myself a little bit of extra working space just in case. We can export just a portion of any given composition. Now, this little thing right here, this is the playhead or current time indicator is the official name for it, but this is essentially going to just represent a specific point in time in our composition. And as I'm moving this around, you can see these numbers here and here are changing. That's that same timecode format, frames, seconds, minutes, hours. It's just letting us know what point in time we're currently viewing within our composition. And that's really important for animating things at specific times. So I'm just gonna move that back to the starting frame at 0 is where we start counting from. I'm gonna dismiss this little tooltip, and we need to go ahead and save our project file. It's a good habit to get in to just start saving early and saving often. That's a motto I got from my friend EJ. I'll go ahead and hit Control S and give this a name. I'll just call it Airplane and click OK. And now this project is saved. And now all I have to do moving forward is hit that keyboard shortcut, Control or Command S to save any changes. Now this is the base artwork for our animation, but I need to add the text down at the bottom over the clouds here. And we're gonna come up to this toolbar right at the top, this long row of tools, and we're looking for the great big T. That's our type tool. So I'm gonna select that, and then down here in my composition, you see that I have a new icon on my mouse cursor. So this is letting me know I'm using the text tool now, and I'm just gonna click right there and type out my message, which is, "You give me a loopy feeling," and I'll press Enter on the number pad to apply that. If you don't have a number pad, Control or Command Enter or Return will also commit that text. Now that's really hard to see. It's basically the same color as the clouds. So let's come over to this panel over here. This is the Properties panel, and this changed when I switched to the text tool and I had this text selected. That's what the Properties panel is gonna do. It's going to contextually switch what it's showing based on your tool or your selection. It's really, really useful. So right down here, this fill color, this is the color of the text. So I'm gonna just select that color and move that over here so we can see the text at the same time and show you that this little color picker allows you to choose absolutely any color that you want in the spectrum. So you can choose a custom color, or what I'm going to do is use this eyedropper tool. I'm gonna click on it once and then sample a color in my composition. And I want it to be the same color as the background. So I'm gonna hover over that blue, click once, and then click OK. And now my text is that same blue color. Now this isn't the font that I want to use, so let's go back to the Properties panel, and I'm going to search for a font, Cooper Standard. There we go. That's the one I want to use. I'd also like to make it bigger, so I'm going to increase the font size just by clicking and dragging on these numbers. This will let me interactively size this, and it's obviously not aligned very well to my composition. I want to move that down and to the center point. So I could switch over to my selection tool again, and then click and drag this just to move it around, or I can use the Align panel, which lives right underneath my video. Let me move myself out of the way. Right here under the Properties panel, Align. If I click on that, it's going to expand it out and give me alignment options. And if you're ever missing one of these panels or you don't see it for some reason, they all live in this Window menu. So just come up to Window and they're all gonna be right in here. So there's Align, there's a lot of disabled ones. There's some down further here, like the main ones like Composition, Project, Timeline. This is where you can turn them on or off. So just wanted to make sure you knew about that. So you can see that it's aligning the layers to the composition. You can have this aligned to other layers if you had multiple layers selected, but this is what I want to do. I want to align it to the center of the composition horizontally. So I just need to find the icon that says align horizontally, which is this one right here. So with that text layer selected, I'll click on align horizontal and it automatically aligns that perfectly centered in my composition. Next, I'd like to move it up a little bit, which there are a few different ways that I could do this. One way is by clicking and dragging, but that's going to shift it off of that horizontally centered axis unless I hold down the modifier key of Shift on the keyboard, and now it's only going to move vertically or horizontally. So that way I can just lift that up a little bit and keep it centered horizontally. I could also use the arrows on the keyboard to just nudge that up or down. And if I again hold the Shift modifier key, that'll make bigger increments of movement as I do that. So a couple different ways of moving layers around. With that, we have everything that we need to start animating our composition. So make sure that you save your project and let's move on to the next section. The way this animation will play out is by starting with the airplane off screen. Outside of the composition, it'll loop in and kind of do this loop-de-loop animation in this heart shape and then go off the screen downwards off the bottom right side. And it's gonna leave this trail creating the heart behind it. And to animate that movement, we're going to be using what are called keyframes. And I'm gonna explain exactly what those are right now. So first of all, let's come down to our timeline. And I wanna make sure not to accidentally move layers around that I don't mean to. As I move my mouse around, you can see that there's kind of a bounding box around each one of these. Same thing if I move my mouse around the layers panel down here in the timeline, it's gonna give me that same highlight around those layers. I don't wanna accidentally click and drag this around when I'm trying to get the airplane. So I'm going to take a look at my switches, which are these little empty boxes right here. You see there are columns that have icons at the top, each one serving a different purpose. So this one right here that looks like a lock, that's going to prevent me from editing that layer. So what I want to do is turn that lock switch on for all of the layers except the airplane, which is right here. And I can actually do that more than one layer at a time if I just click and drag. And now the only layer that I can select is that airplane. Perfect. So what I want to do is use my selection tool and move it off to its starting position, which is back here. And you'll notice it's going behind the clouds because that layer is below the clouds layer in the layer stack. So whatever's above this layer is going to appear on top of it, and anything below it will appear below it, just like pieces of paper on top of each other. So let's back this up down to the bottom left of the screen. Now I'd like to be able to see that section a little bit more clearly, so I'm going to use the hand tool, which is right next to the selection tool. I'll just click on that to click and then drag around my composition. This allows me to pan around and see any part of my composition workspace. So I can still see the outline of the layer, I just can't see the layer itself. Let's switch back to the selection tool and I'll show that I can still click and drag this to move it around. I want to have it about there. And this is where we're going to set our first keyframe on the position property for this layer. So let's go again back over to the properties panel on the right side here, and we'll see that we're looking at the layer transform properties for the airplane layer. So there are lots of different properties here that we can manipulate and modify. As I click and drag this around, you can see that the position property is changing. These are just X and Y coordinates in relationship to the composition itself, telling After Effects that this layer should be at this point. But on the left side of each one of these properties is a little stopwatch, and this is how we can record or set a keyframe for that specific property. So next to position, I'm going to click on that stopwatch, and that icon now switches to a blue diamond. And if we take a look down here in the timeline, we're gonna get a similar shape. It's a diamond highlighted with a blue outline. That highlight is just letting me know that it's selected, but what we've essentially done is recorded that position value at that point in time. Wherever my playhead is, this current time indicator is where that keyframe will be set in time. So we've recorded that position value at frame 0 in this composition. What I can do next is move forward to say 1 second, and then I'll pan over again. I'll just click on that hand tool and reposition my composition here, and then switch back to my selection tool. And now if I click and drag this layer, we're gonna see a line connecting it to the previous keyframe, back where the airplane was originally, and we're gonna get a second keyframe down in the timeline. After Effects is going to automatically add more keyframes as long as you're at a different point in time and manipulating a property that already already had a keyframe. And if I take my playhead and just scrub back and forth between these two keyframes, you can see that it's actually moving between them now. I can even preview this animation if I go to the beginning and I press the space bar. After Effects is going to play that back until I press space again to stop it. So we're already animating, this is great. What I wanna do though is move back to that keyframe, specifically right there. And one really easy way to make sure you're exactly where you need to be is just hold down that modifier shift key again. That's going to snap to a lot of different things in the timeline, including keyframes. So now I know for sure I'm over that keyframe right at 1 second, and you'll notice that the last set of numbers is 0 again. So why was it counting up and now it's 0? Well, it's because that last section of the timecode is measured in frames, remember? So it's counting from 0 up to 29, which would be 30 frames if you count 0, before incrementing the seconds up by 1 and resetting back down to 0. So it's gonna constantly count up from 0 to 29 and then reset back down to 0, or whatever frame rate you have set there. Okay, now let's take a look at the position of this airplane. That's not exactly where I want it. I think I want to put it right about here. I'm using this line of the heart that I have drawn in the background as kind of the alignment for the center point of the airplane. So right about there. And the next place I want this to move to is right here where this kind of crisscross happens. So I'm going to move forward another second and then move the airplane, and that adds another keyframe. And then I'm going to go forward another second and we'll move it to the left side of the heart. Maybe a little bit lower. I'm kind of just eyeballing this, trying to make these 2 points the same. You see this is the motion path, the path that airplane is taking over time. And then I'll go forward one more second, and I'll click and drag the airplane off the screen to the bottom right side. So we've set some keyframes. I just spaced them out evenly by 1 second. We're gonna modify all of this in a bit, but let's just play this back to see that now that airplane is going from one point to the next, all the way around our heart, and that's the foundation of our animation. So how can we make this look a little bit better? Well, first of all, it's just moving in straight lines, right? It's going from point A to point B, and there's no curvature at all to that path. Well, we can manipulate this motion path very similarly to the way that we can manipulate vector paths if you're familiar with drawing shapes in an app like Illustrator or even Photoshop. We have very similar vector editing tools here in After Effects for creating shapes, but we can also use the pen tool, which is right here, I'll click on it now, to manipulate the path that a layer takes over time. So what I want to do is actually select all of my keyframes. And as I did that, you'll notice that all of these squares are now filled because each one of those points represents one of the keyframes. So if I select just the middle one, this is the one that's going to be highlighted and these ones aren't. I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer using the mouse wheel on my mouse. You can also do this with the greater than or less than signs and then just pan over, which by the way, there's a really great keyboard shortcut for the hand tool. All you have to do is hold down the space bar and then we'll temporarily switch to that tool and allow you to click and drag this around. You could do the same thing by clicking and holding down on the middle mouse wheel on your mouse if you have a mouse wheel. But I just wanted to focus on this a little bit. You can see that this looks a little bit different than this one. This one is filled in and the keyframe is highlighted down here. If I grab this keyframe, now this one is filled. So these keyframes down on my timeline are directly correlated to what we're seeing up here in the composition. And seeing those highlights allow us to have a better idea of what is actually being represented in the composition. And another really quick note, you might be wondering why my artwork looks fuzzy here. And it's because I'm looking at my composition at 400% magnification. So essentially 4 times bigger than it actually is, which might be confusing because this is vector artwork. So you'd think that we could scale this up as much as we want, and you actually can. But I have an entire video dedicated to explaining how the relationship between magnification and resolution work in After Effects, how it handles vector graphics, and how it's rasterizing everything all the time. So if you want to learn more about that, I have that video. You can click the card above now to go check that out. But what I want to do is basically fit this back to my composition so I can see the entire thing all at once. So what I'm going to do is click on that magnification menu and say fit up to 100%, meaning it's going to fit that to the size of this panel without magnifying it beyond 100% scale. All right, so with all of that explanation out of the way, let's take a look at how we can use the pen tool to manipulate the shape path. If I just click and drag, you see that this switched to a different tool. This is actually the Convert Vertex tool. When you hover over a point like this, I can click and drag it to add handles and soften out that path so it becomes a curve instead of a straight line. This is what I was talking about with this motion path being just like a vector path in Illustrator. So I can do that to the other side as well. I'll click and drag and pull these handles out, and now these lines kind of line up a little bit better on the bottom. I could click and drag on this point right here in the middle to add handles there, but this isn't exactly the shape that I want, right? I need the airplane to travel from here to here, but then down to here before coming back up and then going around again. So I actually need to go over to that point in time and add in a couple more keyframes. So let's switch back to our selection tool. And I'm actually just gonna click and drag this over arbitrarily. It doesn't really matter at this point, but I wanna click and drag this airplane now in the composition down to this point. So it's at the bottom of that loop. And then what I needed to do is go straight back up to where it was before that. So this keyframe right here, I need to duplicate it over here, which you can do with just copy and paste. Control C, Control V, and that duplicates the keyframe at that point in time where your playhead is. Now my motion path is a little crazy, but we can fix that. The important thing is we have all of the points of motion plotted out in our keyframes. And now I can zoom back in here with my mouse wheel and pan this around with the space bar and modify this motion path. So right now, if I just click and drag this, which I can do with my selection tool, that's also affecting this line right here, which should be about this shape. So what this is telling me is this point down at the base is actually going the opposite direction than it should be. So with that point selected, I'm going to click and drag this around to essentially shape this motion path to fit the motion that I want. Now, if I click and drag on this handle and bring it in, you'll notice that that's also affecting the handle going in the opposite direction right here. Whatever I do here is going to affect this handle as well, unless I switch back to my pen tool and then click and drag on that point. And that detaches the relationship between the two sides of that point. Now, I still want the angles to match, I just don't want their lengths to match. So what I can do is, again, click and drag on that, and it links those angles back up without linking their lengths. So I can make this one shorter, this one longer. If I switch back to my selection tool, that'll maintain that relationship now, and it'll allow me to shape this path a little bit better. So let's continue doing this for all of the points on this path. I need to be able to see behind that cloud so I can see the heart shape. So I'm gonna come over to my panel, look at these switches that I have again, and on the far left is an eyeball icon. This will allow me to disable the visibility of any layer. So I'm just gonna poke that eyeball out, and now I can see underneath, and I can continue to manipulate these path points. So let's just find the right keyframe for that section of the motion path and align that, and that's looking pretty good. Let's just manipulate these paths a little bit more. You can even grab the point itself and click and drag it around, and that actually edits the value of that keyframe. So we're able to very visually lay out the path that this airplane is going to take over time and just do our best to line it up to the artwork. So that's actually looking pretty good. I'm just gonna tweak this a little bit more right here on the end, but let's play this back and see how it looks. Again, I'm going to fit this up to 100% and then play it back. All right, it comes up, it goes around that loop, and it comes off again. All right, not a bad start at all. All of our motion is plotted out. It's behaving the way that it should. It's just not moving very naturally. We obviously don't have any rotation, but the real thing that's off here is that it's not traveling at a very consistent speed at all. So what I wanna do is select all of these middle keyframes, everything between the first and the last. And there's this really cool feature of After Effects keyframes called Rove across time. If I just expand this up a little bit so we can see more of the menu, when I right click on any of these, there's an option for Rove across time. When I click on that, my keyframes are going to move around a little bit. They're gonna get smaller, and they're now gonna be represented by circles instead of diamonds. So what After Effects has done is essentially said, okay, we're gonna take these position values, but we're going to space them out in time based on the keyframes outside of this selection. So if I were to grab this last keyframe now and click and drag it around, you can see that they're proportionally scaling between these two. So I could do that on either side, and it's going to move them around. I'm gonna undo with Control Z, but let's play this back now and see how the timing of that motion happens now. You see now it's much smoother than it was before. The movement is very linear in terms of its speed. It's not speeding up and slowing down much, which is exactly what we wanted for this animation, for the airplane to move very consistently over time. And I think we've got that going. So now that we have the animation on the position property, we can move on to implementing the rotation of the airplane. Now, keyframes are what drive almost every animation in After Effects, and since we've already learned the basics of how to set keyframes on the position property, that knowledge is going to transfer over to the rotation very easily. So let's back this airplane up to the first frame of the composition, and I'm just going to pan this around. Actually, let's make the airplane visible just so I can show you how rotation works. We have the properties panel over here. I could click and drag on one of these values. So rotation is measured in degrees instead of pixels, and you'll see that there's two numbers here. If I rotate this past 360 degrees, then the first number here, it counts up 1 revolution. So that's the difference between those two numbers. I'll undo that and point out that we also have a rotation tool. If I select that, I can click and drag this to rotate it around visually. So I'm just gonna line this up a little bit with the arc of that motion path, and I'm gonna go forward to maybe right about there and set a rotation keyframe. So remember, again, you just click on that stopwatch to add the keyframe. The rotation property is expanded and has a keyframe at that point in time down in our composition. I'm gonna go ahead and pan this back over and we'll continue on our animation. So let's go forward to right about here. This is kind of where I wanna see the airplane pointed straight up. So I'm going to back this up as it gets into its loop here, and then I'll go forward in time. Right about there, it needs to basically be upside down, so I'll rotate it backwards further. And I need to make sure that I'm rotating this in the same direction every time because of those revolutions. After Effects knows which way it's moving, so make sure that when we get to, say, this point right here, you don't rotate it back the opposite direction, because that will now kind of do a backflip and then front flip. That's not what we want. We want it to rotate in this counterclockwise direction so that it's back parallel to the ground basically at this point, and then we'll go forward in time. And actually, instead of it being upside down right here, I want it to be upside down up here. So I'm going to move to that point in time, back this up counterclockwise again, even further, and then let's zoom in on our timeline here. So similar to the way that we zoomed in on the composition, we can zoom in down on the timeline, this time using the keyboard shortcut of plus or minus. Or we could grab this little zoom in and out icon right here. There's also this bar up here. Lots of ways to do lots of things in After Effects. But that'll allow us to view this a little bit more precisely. And essentially what I want to do is grab this rotation keyframe and back it up to this point in time. So let's just click and drag this to back it up to retime that keyframe, and we can move on now. So this is doing its little loop-de-loop. We just have a couple more keyframes to set, one right about there. I'm kind of just using the position keyframe points as my reference for where to set rotation keyframes. And then by this point, it should pretty much be rotated to about this angle right here in line with that motion path, and it can hold that angle. So let's play this back and see what it looks like. Okay, not bad. It's a little bit rigid, it's a little drastic, but let's just zoom out here. And I want to point out that we could preview just a section of our composition using what's called the work area. So let me zoom this all the way out, and you'll see that there's this little blue handle on the ends of my composition. This is called your work area's in and out points. So this bar highlights whatever's within it on the timeline, and After Effects is going to play back that work area range. So if I move this back here and I move my playhead to the start and press the space bar, it's gonna play back that range, and when it gets to the end, loop back to the beginning. So wherever you move your work area, that's the part of your composition that will be previewed, and it makes it easier for watching this repeated times. What I want to do with the rotation to make it look a little bit better is essentially just ease it out a little bit. So what I'm going to do is select all of these keyframes and then Control or Command click on them to convert them to what's called Auto Bezier. Don't worry about what that means. It's just essentially going to smooth out the motion a little bit. And I think that's exactly what it did. The animation just looks a little bit smoother now. There's just one little problem area at the end. What I'd like to see is for it to ease even more strongly into this last rotation keyframe. And to do that, I'm going to right click on the keyframe. So let's expand this out so we can see it better. I'm gonna right click, go to Keyframe Assistant and say Easy Ease. And what that's going to do is change it to this kind of hourglass shape, and that's going to ease into that value even more strongly. So let's play that back one more time and pay attention to the rotation right there. It's a very subtle difference, but this is one of those things that as an animator, you get very used to seeing those little tiny minute details in the motion. And I think that little bit of easing at the end helps smooth it out and make it look just a little bit more natural. I just want to do the same thing to the first rotation keyframe, and I'm actually going to back it up to right about here. Now, as I moved it, you see that the icon changed to that hourglass shape. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's set to the Easy Ease value. It just means that it has custom easing applied to it. And you do not need to know about custom easing at this point, but just know that it is a very big part of After Effects. This button right here opens up what's called the graph editor, which just changes our view of our keyframe values over time. And I have, again, another tutorial dedicated to explaining how this graph editor works if you're interested in learning about that later. You do not need to learn about it right now. So I'm going to, again, Easy Ease it. The keyboard shortcut for this is F9, which you might need to hold down the function key on your keyboard, depending on your keyboard's layout, but I'm gonna just press F9 to Easy Ease that keyframe. And one other thing I wanna point out, this green bar that I haven't brought up yet, this is After Effects telling you that it has cached those frames and it's able to play them back in real time. And there was a gap right here where it wasn't green. If I just move this keyframe for a second, you'll see it. In the background, if you don't do anything for a while, After Effects should cache those frames automatically just to speed up your render times. And there we go, we can see that it just happened here. But if you ever notice when you play a composition back, if it's not playing back in real time, if it's stuttering, that's just After Effects taking time to preview and cache those frames to be able to play it back for you in real time after it's made it through that entire cache. After Effects is not like a video editor where it can just play a video back in real time instantly. It has to calculate each and every frame before it can show it to you. But now that we've got our position and rotation keyframes set, we can move on to some of the final elements. Okay, this whole time we've been using the heart as a reference for the motion, but I want that to be part of the animation as well. And since this is Illustrator artwork and I drew that with a path, I can actually convert the artwork into a path that I can manipulate here in After Effects. So let's switch over to our selection tool, and I'm going to lock up that airplane layer, and I'm gonna turn that cloud layer back on, and then let's find the heart right here and unlock that layer. So now I can select it. If I right click on that layer, there's a menu called Create, and under that is Create Shapes from Vector Layer. If I do that, a few things are gonna happen. One, the heart artwork is going to be disabled. We're not gonna see it anymore, but it's also going to generate a new layer with a star icon. This is an After Effects shape layer, which is its vector type of layer, and you see that it's named Heart Outlines. And what that means is it just made an outlined version of that artwork, that Illustrator file, as a shape layer here in After Effects. With that same vector path, the same styling applied, it's just now in a format that I can edit using the pen tool or other After Effects tools. And the first thing I want to change is its appearance. It's a thin white solid line, but I want it to look kind of like a smoke trail coming out of the airplane. So I want to make it thicker and I want to make it dashed. So let's look at the properties panel again. Even without going into this layer and finding the specific properties, we can see them expanded out over here, which is a huge time saver. Underneath these shape properties, I'm able to change things like the stroke color, the stroke width, which is something I want to do. So I'm going to click and drag that to make it a little bit bigger, but there is no section for adding in a dash. So this is something that I'm gonna need to actually go into the shape layers contents to do. So let's take a look at our layers panel. This little arrow next to the layer allows me to expand out the contents of that layer. So transform properties, contents of the shape layer, all different things about that layer are stored in this menu. And if we go into the first group, contents, we're gonna see a group called Group 1. This is the structure of a shape layer. You don't need to worry about how this is made up right now, but we're gonna go into that first group and there's the path. This is the actual vector path. Underneath that is the stroke. This is what is styling that path. If I disable the visibility, turn it back on, you can see that is what we're actually seeing being applied to this path. And inside of that is where we're going to find our dashes. So this opens up a lot of the same options that we had in the properties panel, but in addition, dashes. So this little plus icon right here, I'm gonna press the plus and that adds a dash, and I'm gonna press it one more time to give me the option to control the gap between dashes. So I'm gonna zoom in here with the greater sign on my keyboard, and I'm going to increase that gap. And as I do that, you can see that we now have this dashed line that we can manipulate. So I'm gonna make my dashes just a little bit longer, and that gap size looks pretty good. Let's just move the airplane out of the way so we can see the entire heart. That's looking pretty good, but this little misalignment is kind of bothering me. So what I wanna do is grab this property right here, offset. If I click and drag this, it's going to shift all of those dashes around the path. I just want to move it ever so slightly until it looks like it's nice and visually centered. I think that looks good. So let's set this back to fit up to 100%. And now my heart has that dashed line to it. Now, I obviously don't want to see the entire heart the whole time, so I'm going to back this up to right about here, and then I'm going to scroll up in my layers so I can see a little bit more of my shape layer. I'll actually go ahead and close up the stroke options, and this menu right here, Add, I'm going to click on that, and it's going off my screen, so let me make this a little bit bigger. I'm going to just click and drag this panel to expand it up. Go to that Add menu, and we're looking for Trim Paths. These are called shape layer operators. They do all kinds of things to manipulate your vector paths. Trim Paths is going to allow us to make this look like it's essentially drawing on. So let's make this a little bit bigger again, expand Trim Paths, and we have 3 properties, Start, End, and Offset. The only one we really need to worry about is End, and that's set to 100% by default. But if I click and drag this back, you can see that it's literally trimming that path back and allowing us to manipulate how much of that dashed line we're seeing at any given time. And because we have a stopwatch right here, that's letting us know we can keyframe this property and animate it over time. So I'll start it at a value of 0 and click on that stopwatch to add that keyframe. I don't need to see anything else down in my layer here. I just want to see that keyframed property. So what I'll do is press the keyboard shortcut U to reveal just the keyframes for that layer, which gives me a lot more real estate and room to work in my composition. With that keyframe set, let's go forward in time until that airplane gets back down to basically the same place and increase this value up to 100. Now that line should be synchronized with the airplane and animate just in time to be hidden by the airplane and revealed out the tail, which is exactly what's happening. That looks great. Now this layer doesn't need to exist before it's being drawn on, so what I'm gonna do is again, hold Shift while dragging to snap to that point in time, and then trim this layer so that it's not visible at all, even if the eyeball icon is enabled, until this point. And to do that, with the selection tool, I'm just gonna click and drag on this point right here. You see that double arrow? This is the in point of the layer. Again, hold Shift to snap, and I'm gonna snap it right to that point in time. Now that layer isn't even going to be calculated until that point in time. So I'll play this back one more time. Airplane comes out, does its loop, the trail is animating on. That looks really great. There's just one more detail I want to add to the heart, which is that stroke width kind of growing, almost like the smoke is kind of dissipating over time, and then have it fade out. So let's again go to the first frame of that layer, so hold Shift to snap to that point in time, and the stroke width is the property that I want to manipulate. So over here in the Properties panel, I'm again going to set a keyframe for stroke width. I might even turn that down a little bit. I can't see it right now, but I'm guessing 10 will be a good width to start. And then I'll go forward in time until we get to the end of our loop, which will probably be around 4 seconds is what I'm guessing. So I'm just gonna extend my work area's out point a little bit further. But right about there at 4 seconds, I want the stroke width to be larger. So right about there, that looks pretty good. And now that stroke width is going to animate over time. So it comes out, it's growing, expanding out. And then once the airplane gets down into the clouds, that's essentially where I want the heart to start fading out. So we're gonna do that using the opacity for the layer, which is up here under the layer transform controls. Opacity is right down at the bottom. I'll set a keyframe by clicking on the stopwatch right there and then move forward in time until that 4-second mark and turn that value down to 0. So now it's going to loop out, the stroke is going to grow over time and then eventually fade out. And with that, we've animated our smoke trail. All right, we're almost done. Let's move on to the clouds. I'm gonna collapse this layer up and lock it, as well as the heart layer, even though we can't see it, just for good measure, I'm gonna lock that. And let's unlock the right and left clouds. All I want to do with these clouds is have them kind of slowly drift out and in. And the reason I want them to move that way is so that they can start and end in the exact same place and create a seamless loop. So let's set position keyframes on both of these. I can do that at the same time with both selected over in the properties panel, clicking on that position stopwatch again. So that will add a keyframe to any number of layers that you have selected. Then let's go to the end of the animation. Let's just say that we're trying to make this a 4-second loop. I'll go to 4 seconds, and then I want to add another position keyframe. So the stopwatch is gone, but I can click on that keyframe icon, and that will add a duplicate set of keyframes right there. Now let's go to the center point of our loop, which would be 2 seconds in, and this is where I want the clouds to change their position. So I'm gonna deselect by just clicking down here between layers, and then just click and drag this cloud to the right, and I'll hold Shift so that it's moving just horizontally. And it doesn't need to be a lot. I'm just gonna move it out about that much, and I'll do the same thing for the smaller cloud on the left, but to the left instead of the right. So I'll again click and drag, hold Shift so that it moves horizontally only, and move about that much, and we'll preview the animation. So now those clouds should move out and then back in, but it's completely linear. There's no smoothness to that motion at all. So let's use our easy ease trick. I'm gonna select all 6 of these keyframes by clicking and dragging in this dark gray area, make that selection box, select all 6 at once, and then press F9 on the keyboard to apply easy ease to all of them. Now if I play this back, we're gonna start a lot smoother. It's gonna get to that resting point more easily and go back and forth nice and smooth. So that's great, but the end here, we're not actually looping at the 4-second mark. So there's a point where these clouds are just sitting still and not moving at all. So what I need to do is move my work area's out point to that keyframe. Again, holding that Shift modifier key to snap it to that point in time. And now it's going to preview this seamless loop within that 4-second range, and we can see that those clouds never have any kind of jumping or pausing. It's looping seamlessly. That looks great. The last thing we need to do is animate the text and the clouds. So let's unlock those 2 layers, text layer right here, the clouds bottom layer right there. And what I want to do is select both of those at the same time. So to make a selection of both, I'll hold Shift and click on that second layer. And what I want to do is combine these into one. And we're going to do that by a method called precomposing. So I'm going to come up to the layer menu, down to the very bottom here, precompose. And this is going to bring up a menu saying, what do you want to call this new composition? So we'll just call this clouds and text. And for these other options, move all attributes is going to be the only one that you can select. You don't have to check either of these other 2. Just click OK. And what that's done is combined both of those layers into a new composition that's the same size as this one. So visually nothing changed, except that those 2 layers are no longer visible in this composition. And we have this new icon, which is the same as the one up here for a composition. This is just called a pre-comp because it's a composition nested within another one. And I can access the contents of that by double clicking on it, and there we go, we have our text and our cloud layers. So I don't actually need to do anything in this composition, but double clicking on it will open it up, and you can see it shows as tabs down here in our timeline, and I can close this one out so that I don't actually need to clutter up my workspace anymore. But that's what a pre-comp is for, combining multiple layers into a single composition. Now that we've got those combined, we're going to add an effect to them to animate a wave motion for the text and the clouds at the same time. So let's come over to our side panel over here again and go to Effects and Presets. And this is where all of the effects of After Effects exist, which, by the way, I've created a tutorial on how every single effect in After Effects works. All you have to do is search YouTube for that effect name, and inevitably my tutorial will come up for it. Look for the green thumbnails. And there's obviously a lot of effects here. It can be very overwhelming. Fortunately, there is a search bar, so you can search for the specific effect you're looking for, and the one that we want is called Wave Warp. So I'm gonna search for that, and then click and drag that out onto that layer. You can do it up in the composition, down here in the timeline, and that will apply the effect to that layer. So over here on the left side, it's moved from the project panel to the effect controls panel. And that does exactly what you would think. It gives you controls for the effects you've applied to your selected layers. Every effect is unique, it has its own set of controls, but as you can see, basically every single one of these properties can be keyframed. So that's always something to look out for. If there's a stopwatch, that means you can animate it. Fortunately for us, this effect is actually animating on its own. So if I preview the animation, we've got this really distorted wavy pattern playing through that graphic. And obviously that's a little bit more extreme than we want. So what I want to do is come over to the wave width and increase this value a lot. In fact, I'm going to click on it once. That's another way to manipulate a property. And then I can type in a value. So I'm just going to say 200. I want this wave to be nice and wide. And I think that looks a little bit better. In fact, we could even crank this up to 400 if we wanted. Choose whatever width that you want. I think that looks nice and smooth, so I'm gonna go with 400. But it's moving up and down a little bit more than I want, so that's what the wave height property is for. I think I'm gonna cut that in half and turn it down to 5. So now it's not quite so much ocean waves, and it's a little bit slower, more peaceful clouds kind of just moving up and down. But since we combined the text with the clouds, it's being applied to both of them at the same time, which is exactly what we wanted. Now, if you're paying attention, let me zoom in here at the bottom, you might notice that we can see through the clouds to the background, which is not what we want at all. That's just a result of the distortion, that wave moving through the artwork. So what I'm going to do is come down to this pinning property, and this is just something that you have to learn. You have to learn how effects work, which is why I made the Effects of After Effects series. But this is going to allow us to basically say certain edges of this layer should not be affected by the wave. We're going to pin those down so they're not distorted. Bottom edge is the one that I want to pin. So I'm going to select that, and now that fills that gap. It prevents the bottom from being distorted, and if I play this back, we've got that same distortion moving through that text, but down at the bottom, that cloud is pinned to our composition, and with that, we've completed our entire seamless loop. Now, if you're animating this roller coaster project instead, or you're coming back to this after watching the whole class, I want to point out something with the wave warp effect. It would be perfect for these flags. So let's just add the wave warp effect to it. And I want to show you an issue that comes up. I'm going to zoom in here and pan to the flag. And if I play this back, you can see that the flag's distortion is getting cropped off at the layer's bounds, at the edges. And that obviously isn't what we want. Now, this is just a behavior of After Effects that you have to be used to and learn how to work around. The way that we're gonna work around it is by pre-composing this layer. So let's, with it selected, go up to Layer, down to Precompose, and we'll just name it Flag Precomp. And now we have multiple options because this selection actually has an effect applied to it. So we can leave all the attributes in roller coaster, the comp we're in, or move all the attributes to the new composition, which is what we did before. This time I want to leave the attributes here, meaning this effect is going to stay in this comp, not in the pre-comp. So I'll leave that enabled and click OK. And now my layer has been replaced with a pre-comp and the wave warp effect is still applied to it. But that still didn't solve our problem because my pre-comp is still the same size as the layer. So what I'll do is double click on that pre-comp to go into the new comp. And here we can see our original flag layer. And I want to change the dimensions of this comp. So go up to the composition menu, say composition settings, and then I just want to change the height. So I'm going to move this over so we can see this happening while I do it. I don't have an actual number in mind. I just know I need this to be bigger. Now, when I did that, it also made it wider because I accidentally had lock aspect ratio checked. That means it's going to keep that same width to height ratio as I change these numbers. So I'm actually going to hit cancel so I get back to where we were. Then go back into my composition settings and first uncheck that checkbox. And now I can change the height independently from the width. And that's probably fine right there. I just want to give enough room on top and bottom for that wave distortion to be able to be seen as it's animating through that flag. So I'll click OK and close this pre-comp, and now we can see that nice wavy distortion moving through the flag. And if I play this back, it's moving in the opposite direction that I want it to be. So let's reverse that by going to the direction property, and instead of 90 degrees, I want to change the direction to -90 degrees. So I'll just type that in and press enter. Now the flag is moving in the correct direction, but I want to make the width a little bit wider. So why don't we say something like 120 on the wave width? I like the way that that looks, but now I need to pin the right edge of the flag so that it looks like it's attached to the pole. So let's go to the pinning, change it from none to right edge, and now that edge is going to stick to that pole and the flag is going to wave up and down with it. I think that looks good. Let me just fit this back up to 100%. I want to now just transfer that over to the other flag. But what's really cool is that since I've now created a pre-comp with the effect already applied, and this is the exact same element, I can just make a copy of this pre-comp and move it over. So I'll use the keyboard shortcut Control or Command D to duplicate it, and then I can just click and drag this while holding Shift and move it over into place where that left flag is. And now I can just turn that flag left layer off, and I now have two instances of that same comp with that same animation happening. And if we wanted to change up the phase a little bit so these aren't waving exactly the same on each instance, I could grab, say, the second one and come to the phase property of the wave warp effect and just give it a different number. And now those two flags are going to be distorted at different phases, but the same rate. So they're moving at the same speed, they're just waving at different points in time. Now that our animation is playing back seamlessly, it's ready to export as a GIF. Now, when I originally created this class 10 years ago, GIFs were a lot more prevalent. They're not quite as much anymore, people definitely still use them, but more commonly nowadays, people are using MP4 video files to share online. So I'm gonna show you how to export both. First of all, let's start with GIF. So the way that we're gonna do this is first start by setting your work area to the range of the composition you want to be exported. That's the default setting of After Effects. Whatever's within your work area is what will be exported. Then we're gonna come up to the composition menu and down to Add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue. So that's kind of a mouthful, but just add it to the Media Encoder queue, and this is going to open another app, Adobe Media Encoder. You don't have to know how to use this. I'm just gonna show you exactly what we need to do to get a GIF out of After Effects exported through Media Encoder, but eventually it'll open up after it's loaded your project. It should show up in this queue panel. So there's the After Effects project, the name of the comp, and we need to change the format. Right now it's set to a video file, but I wanna change this to animated GIF, not GIF down here, animated GIF, and then we're gonna change our preset. So it's currently set to animated GIF with transparency. I don't have any transparency in my composition, so I don't need to preserve that. So I'm just gonna switch it to animated GIF match source. And that match source just means that it's going to match the resolution and the frame rate of the composition from After Effects. Then you just choose where you wanna output it to by clicking on this text. Choose any location on your computer, give it a different name if you want, but then all you need to do is click this green start button. After Effects will link to Media Encoder. We'll see this preview and a progress bar. And once it's completed, you can just click on the output file, that'll open it up, and you can double click on the GIF to play it back. Now, if you're on a Mac, Preview cannot play back animated GIFs. It's gonna show up as an image sequence. Just drag the file to Chrome or hit the space bar to preview it that way, and it should play back just fine. But that's how you can export an animated GIF using Adobe Media Encoder. Now let's take a look at how we could do the same thing using After Effects to export an MP4 video file. One thing that you need to keep in mind though is that we're going to export this as a 4-second video file. And if you're gonna post this somewhere like Instagram or someplace where the video isn't going to automatically loop, you might wanna build in custom manual loops. And I'll show you exactly how to do that. So let's just unlock all of our layers real quick, and I'll select all of them at once. Click on one of them, hold Shift, and click on the last one. That makes a selection of everything. And I wanna precompose all of these layers now into one composition. So let's go up to Layer, down to Precompose, and I'll call this Airplane Animation. And again, just make sure Move All Attributes and these other two checkboxes are unchecked. Click OK. And now that entire animation is contained in one layer. So let's go to that 4-second mark, which is right here, and I wanna trim this layer's out point to that point in time. So I'm gonna grab the out point of that layer and drag it to the left, hold Shift to snap it to that point. Now it's 4 seconds long, and what I can do is just duplicate this layer by going up to Edit and down to Duplicate, or Control or Command D is the keyboard shortcut. And that makes a duplicate of this layer, which I can now offset in time with the selection tool. You can see that animation is playing through as I do this, and I'll just hold Shift again to snap that in point to this layer's out point. And now we have a built-in manual loop. I'm gonna do that one more time. So with this selected, Control or Command D to duplicate, click and drag, hold Shift until that snaps to that point, but now the duration of my loop is greater than the duration of my composition, so I need to modify my composition settings. Let's go up to Composition, composition settings, and increase the duration to just say 20 seconds instead of 10. And that gives me this extra room to complete this loop. So let's go to the out point of that layer, again, holding Shift while dragging, and then set the work area's out point by clicking and dragging while holding Shift. And now once it gets to the end of those 3 loops, that's when it goes back to the start of the video. But it'll at least give us 12 seconds of uninterrupted playback before the end of the video that we export. All right, now that we've got our work area set, our 3 manual loops, let's go up to composition and say add to render queue instead of media encoder. And that will open up the render queue panel right here. Now I wanna move this up here. You can rearrange any panel in After Effects just by clicking and dragging on its name. And you see all these purple highlights that are showing up. These are the different panel groups in my workspace. I want it to live right here on the composition, so I'm gonna let go of it, and that's going to combine it into this panel group. So I can now tab through these 2 different tabs for the different panels. Now, I'm not gonna walk you through every single thing you need to know about the render queue, just what you need to know to export it. After Effects is defaulted to giving me the output module I want, which is an H.264 compression video. This is gonna give us an MP4 file. If you're not set to that, just find that preset right there in this list. That's the one we want. And then right here where it says not yet specified, this is the output location. So again, click on that, choose the folder that you wanna export to, give it a name, click save, and now this queue is ready to export. So just click on the render button, and this will again give us a progress bar. It'll play through and give us a chime, and that lets you know that your render is complete. Now that that's done, we can navigate to the folder on the computer we exported to. There's my MP4, I can preview this, and there's the animation playing back. It's going to loop through it 3 times before coming to the end because of those manual loops that we built into our composition. And that looks great. So my little preview is going to continue to loop that, but it's ready to go. You can upload this to Instagram or anywhere online, and it should play back just fine. And with that, you've just completed your very first motion design project. Congratulations. I would love it if you shared your project anywhere online and tagged me at Jake in Motion so I can see it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them down in the comments. And if you want to get plugged into a motion design community, join the Jake in Motion Discord server. It's filled with amazing people. I'm in there all the time, so come say hi. There's an invite link down in the description. And don't forget that there's also a discount code in the description for launch into After Effects, which is a perfect next step from this course. If you're interested in getting a comprehensive, foundational understanding of After Effects, it's the course I wish I had when I started learning, and I think you'll love it too. I also have a whole lot of free content here on YouTube, so make sure you browse my playlist as you continue your motion design journey. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one.